Hey everyone, welcome to the Still Naz One podcast. Today, our host is Pastor Kent Vandervoort, and he's leading us in a discussion about the history of pandemics in York County. Before we jump into the conversation, make sure that you subscribe to our YouTube page and ring that church bell for notifications when we post new videos. All right, now let's get into it.
Well, welcome. This is Kent Vandervoort. I'm one of the pastors on staff at Still Meadow. We are in a unique time in our history. Our mission doesn't change. The call to disciples remains the same. But now we get to figure out what it looks like and how to follow Jesus as individuals and families in a pandemic. So we're going to do a series of podcasts, and we have been on tackling topics ranging from family to fitness to finances and beyond. We are doing the ZoomCast where people join us to listen in and ask questions. That'll be on Wednesday night, May 20th at 7:30. We encourage you to join with us. Each week we want to walk away with one thing. And today's topic is, what can we learn from history? This is a historic time, and on this podcast, I'm speaking with our resident historian. My guest today is Scott L. Mingus Sr., husband, father, grandpa, inventor, scientist, historian, a member of Still Meadow, an all-around good guy. Scott and his family have been a part of Still Meadow for 19 years, after being members for 23 years of the Paynesville, Ohio Church of the Nazarene. He currently serves on our church board. Scott is a retired scientist and consultant in the global pulp and paper industry and holds patents in self-adhesive postage stamps and barcode labels. He has written 22 Civil War and Underground Railroad books. His biography of Confederate General William Extra Billy Smith won multiple awards, including the Dr. James I. Robertson Jr. Literary Prize for Confederate History. He has also written several articles for the Gettysburg Magazine as well as for various historical journals. He has appeared multiple times on PNC, the Pennsylvania Cable Network, C-SPAN, C-SPAN 3, and various other networks. And I'm so glad to know that Scott is a disciple of Jesus Christ. And today we're going to be talking to him about how this plays in history, given the fact that in the past there was a other pandemic that we've often heard talked about. But before we get into that, how are you doing? How are you and Debbie doing, Scott?
Well, thanks, Kent, for asking. Yeah, we're doing fine. We've been holding Zoom conferences with our grandkids, so we get a chance to stay in touch with them, but otherwise we feel healthy and all's well.
Cool. Well, when this all began, the COVID-19 disruption, you wrote an article in the York Daily Record blog referring to another time in our history when a pandemic hit. Would you share with us about that?
Sure. Back in 1918, there was a major international incident called the Spanish Influenza. 50 million people, in fact, died as a result of that. Started in late 1917, perhaps in Kansas, went around the world, died out by the spring of 1918, came back with a vengeance then in the late summer of 1918, and eventually, as mentioned, killed 50 million people, including several hundred people here in York County. And as we're going to find out as we chat today, there are a lot of parallels from what happened in 1918, 1919 to what we're going through today.
Wow, what were some of the effects it had on our society at the time?
Yeah, if you look at the flu of 1918, 1919, as it first went around, people, frankly, didn't think much about it. Then reports started coming in that soldiers were getting sick, coming back from Europe, that army camps were infected, and society began, unfortunately, here in York County, finding out that their loved ones were either quite ill or were quite sick. But by and large, people did not pay much attention to it until late September 1918, when it really came home to Pennsylvania. There was a welcome home parade in Philadelphia for the soldiers of that area. Within 2 weeks, 2,600 people were dead in Philadelphia. But here in York County, still at that stage, no one had gotten ill. There was a lady who actually traveled up to Rhode Island to see her son. Some accounts would believe she was patient zero. here in York County that she came back having contracted the disease at an Army hospital and then started spreading it to her family members. So here in York County, within fairly short order, people were getting ill. Back in the town of Wrightsville, more than a third of the town was sick. Eventually, two-thirds of the town would get sick. So businesses began closing. The York Haven Paper Company, which was one of the largest employers in the county at that time, closed its doors because they didn't have enough people to work. Churches were left open as long as the individual pastors wanted to, or the individual communities, which then began shutting them down. Spring Grove being one of the first communities ordering its churches to close, with only 3 people having become sick. And as it turned out, that, if you will, to use a modern phrase, flattening of the curve, led to the point of Spring Grove having very few infestations compared to a place like Wrightsville, where schools and churches and businesses stayed open as long as possible, even to the point where medical people were already getting sick, and yet the town stayed pretty much open. York City closed down in phases. The churches were finally ordered to shut down. Businesses were shut down. One of the more humorous aspects is it became a crime in the city of York to spit on the sidewalk because they did not want people to share the disease in that matter. And of course, spitting was quite popular in that society in those days with chewing tobacco, etc. So that became an actual fine in the city of York if you spit on the sidewalks. So it was a pretty interesting time. Families, of course, started retreating to their homes, started retreating to their farms, and then people would come visit them, and unfortunately they would spread the disease because they would bring them food or blankets or reading material or clothing, anything else they had, but did not quite understand that they needed to stay out of the houses or just drop things off on the porches. So people were getting sick. By the time they were done, there were more than 400 or 500 people at a minimum died in York County. The number's still somewhat uncertain because it got twisted into people who were dying of pneumonia and other things. And so the reporting as actual Spanish flu did not start until they actually did telephone surveys of people who were ill throughout York and had them self-report that, yeah, I think I have the Spanish flu. And then the medical facilities assumed they did, and that's how they counted.
So no testing back then?
No, they didn't have testing, of course. So obviously the big thing today is, do you or don't you have it? Back then, short of a doctor actually coming and making a diagnosis, which wasn't happening. It was all self-reported via telephone or via card. People could actually mail a card in that says, yeah, I'm sick, count me.
Oh, wow. So how did that play with the religious community? You touched on it early on, but take it a step further.
Yeah, I think the churches, obviously, as they were starting to be banned from actually meeting, started a number of outreach programs. In some cases, you would have pastors that would drive by his parishioners in his carriage, or if they happen to be so fortunate, most didn't, to have a horseless carriage, an early motor car. You could, converse with your congregants on their porches while you stayed on your carriage or on your horseback or on the sidewalk yourself and talk to them. The churches got involved, of course, in helping with feeding people, helping with families. In a lot of cases, there were farms where the entire family was down for the count, and other nearby farmers or church members would come and work their fields, help them bring in harvest, things like that. So there was certainly a time when the church did not retreat. The church was actually advancing and trying to minister to people despite the fact they could not physically enter a building.
And that went on for quite some time. I think they were out of the buildings. Is that correct?
They did. In fact, most churches did not restart until 1919. So you're talking, several months since the time the first of them went down. And even then, it was a slow reopening in most cases. The interesting thing to me, Kent, is the next 2 or 3 years, the reaction here in York County. It was a fertile time that many churches saw expansion. As their congregations finally came back to normal, they continued to reach out and brought in new people. And in fact, the period through 1922 or so was an area of intense church planning. where a number of York's churches can trace their origins back to that post-World War I era, where traveling ministers would come to this area and do church plants. So it became a time that instead of retreating, the church was definitely advancing.
When how did that parallel with that time with this time? In other words, we hear it, but now how does that play out?
Yeah, I think there were several parallels. I mean, one of the things that was back in those days, people were asked to wear masks. They obviously didn't have the surgical masks that we have today for our medical workers. They were all homemade masks in most cases. We had parallels in business being ordered to close. We had parallels, of course, in the fact that there were three basic responses. People in York County could either say, I'm not going to do this. I refuse to wear a mask. I'm going to keep my business open. In fact, there was a very prominent business owner in Dover who 3 times resisted court orders to shut down, and finally they had to send the sheriff in to padlock the guy's business because he refused to comply, and people were getting ill, they think because of that. The second response, of course, were people were retreating into their homes and doing absolutely nothing other than just riding out the storm, which was fine. That was the orders they were under. And the third were the groups that were finding creative ways to help people while still doing it safely, delivering food to people's doorsteps, for example, or, as mentioned earlier, bringing in their crops, their farms, or helping take care of their animals, so horses, things like that, grooming them while they were ill. So there were plenty of ways people were finding to safely help their neighbors through the period as well.
If there's one key takeaway for us to learn from this historic perspective, what would that be?
I think the biggest takeaway is that we can't be afraid. Obviously, whether COVID-19 were to enter your household or you yourself get it, there are plenty of other ways. Obviously, we can die or be ill or be injured. And we can't fear COVID-19 any more than we can fear cancer. I'm a cancer survivor. So I think I have the perspective that, if it's your time, it's going to be your time. But you can't live in fear. You need to understand that, you do whatever's proper to take care of yourself and your family. But above all else, do not fear. Put your trust in the Lord and carry on.
That's a great way to wrap this up. As we were walking through the historical perspective, the thought keeps coming and playing in the back of my head. God's word tells us throughout history, but God in speaking to us is always, fear not, do not be afraid. And for me, Psalms 46, verse 10 is kind of my life verse. Be still and know that I am God. And so in the midst of all this, from a historical perspective, we need to be reminded that God is still in control. And throughout this whole process of COVID, we don't know what's going to happen next, but we can see that through history, we've come through this before. It's not the first time God's ever handled a situation. It won't be the last, and he really does know what he's doing. So just be still. Take a pause, time out, be still, and know that he is God. He's God. Well, thank you again, Scott. And if people want to get a hold of you, how can they do that?
Sure, there's a couple of easy ways. One is feel free to send me a friend request on Facebook. I am Scott Mingus Sr., not to be confused with my son, who is also a member of Still Meadow. Probably easier is send me an email. My email address is scottmingus, that's SCOTTMINGUS, at Yahoo, that's YAHOO.com. So scottmingus@yahoo.com.
Well, thank you. And I know that there's another way that they can also read your historical perspective, and that's by going and logging on to the yorkblog.com Cannonball. That's part of the York Daily Record, I believe, but it's yorkblog.com and then Cannonball, CANNONBALL. Again, thank you. We are so glad that you have participated throughout these podcasts. We have another one coming up next week, and we look forward to you coming and witnessing that one with us as well. I believe Pastor Rachel is leading that one. One thing you can do during this time is, well, there's actually a couple of things you can do. The first thing you can do is check on your neighbors. Scott talked about it. Historically, the church was involved in caring for people. So check on your neighbors. That's the first thing. The second thing is be in prayer. And the third thing is sign up on our COVID response page. It's still NAS / COVID-19. Sign up there, and we encourage you. Someone will be get you involved. There's ways for you to be involved and engaged throughout this entire process. We look forward to the next time we see you, and we look forward to the next podcast coming out. Thank you, and once again, remember, be still. Know that God's in control, and He's got this.
Thank you so much for joining us for this conversation. If you enjoyed it, please make sure you go ahead and like the video down below, and let us know in the comments what was the most interesting part of the conversation for you. Also, you got a great idea for an interesting show you would like to see? Let us know down in the comments below. All right, everyone, God bless. Have a great week.